Hello, I'm John David Bruja in Eastern Passage, Nova Scotia on the Captain's Pride. Welcome to a special edition of John's Traveling Movie Corner. Hello, I'm John David Bruja in Halifax Harbor, Nova Scotia. Welcome to a special edition of John's Traveling Movie Corner, United States Lighthouse Society, Nova Scotia, and Prince Edward Island tour. Now on this tour, we hope to see up to 80 lighthouses, historic buildings, museums, forts, and so much more. I hope you enjoy the ride. We flew out of Terminal 1 in Minneapolis, Minnesota, with a layover in Montreal, Canada, passed through customs and toured the terminal, and boarded a small plane to Halifax, Nova Scotia, where we arrived early Saturday morning. Finally getting some sleep, we got up the next morning, had breakfast, and headed up the street a couple of blocks to the Old Town Clock, a gift from Prince Edward, Duke of Kent. The clock was completed in 1803. Then it was off to the Citadel Hill, or Fort George. 4 fortifications have been built in Halifax since 1749, the last a concrete star fort. The current citadel was built in 1856, and we were lucky enough to make it in time for the firing of the cannon at noon, a tradition since 1857. Well, first up, we head to the Harbor Wharf in Eastern Passage, Nova Scotia for a 3-hour cruise on the Atlantic Ocean to see 4 lighthouses, weather permitting. We'll be boarding the Captain's Pride, chartered by the A&M Sea Charters Fisherman's Cove, Nova Scotia. Once we left the harbor and started our cruise on the Atlantic Ocean, we could see Halifax Harbor and George's Island and the lighthouse in the distance. And before reaching our first lighthouse, we saw a couple of range lights in the distance, the Halifax Harbor middle, front, and rear range lights. Our first lighthouse, Major Beach Lighthouse. Located on McNabb's Island, also known as Cornwallis Island, it is the largest island in the Halifax Harbor. The first light was established in 1828. The current light was built in 1941 at a height of 58 feet. The foghorn was moved to the lighthouse, and the fog alarm building was demolished in 1975. Major Beach Lighthouse was automated in 1983. The next lighthouse in the distance is Chipuktu Head Lighthouse. The first one was in 1872, and the current one you see behind me is in 1967. There was one in between, but it had to be destroyed so they could put weaponry displacement for World War II in there. At a height of 45 feet, the Chipuktu Head Lighthouse had a concrete tower and was automated in 1978. Well, next up was supposed to be Sambro Island Lighthouse, the oldest lighthouse in Canada. But unfortunately, as you could tell near the end of Chipuktu Head Lighthouse, the fog was starting to overtake it. So for safety concern, we had to pass on the oldest lighthouse in Nova Scotia and Canada and head to our next lighthouse, Devil's Island Lighthouse. And hopefully we have better luck. Well, thanks to the great navigators of the Captain's Pride, we did get to see Devil's Island Lighthouse, located on Devil's Island, also known as British Wood Island, French Green Island, and Ruse Island after Captain John Ruse. Located on the outermost island in Halifax Harbor, Devil's Island Lighthouse was first lit in 1852, and the current light was built in 1877 at a height of 46 feet. Unfortunately, the keeper's dwelling, built in the 1930s, was destroyed by a storm in 2012. Devil's Island Lighthouse was decommissioned after battling the elements. Well, we're at the Halifax Harbor in Nova Scotia, getting ready to board a ferry to go to George's Island to see, well, of course, George's Island Lighthouse. As we left Halifax Harbor and made our way to George's Island, it was surrounded in an eerie fog-like mist, but cleared as we got closer to the lighthouse and the dock. We are now on George's Island, named after King George II. It served as a prison from 1755 to 1763, and there is even a fort here, Fort Charlotte, which we'll check out. And behind me is the George's Island Lighthouse, just off of the Halifax Harbor in Nova Scotia. The first light arrived in 1876, and the current light behind me was built in 1917 at a height of 54 feet. The octagonal concrete tower was joined by a brick keeper's dwelling, which is still standing today, just a few hundred feet away. It became automated in 1972, and in 1973, the red stripe was added. In 1965, it was declared a National Historic Site. And after seeing George's Island Lighthouse, we stepped back in time and checked out Fort Charlotte behind us, also on George's Island. Fort Charlotte was a British colonial coastal fort established in 1795 by Prince Edward. The original Fort Charlotte was also star-shaped in design. Used prominently during several wars, including World War I and World War II, where the last soldiers served on the island. It was declared a National Historic Site in 1965. After leaving George's Island, the lighthouse, and Fort Charlotte, we did see one more lighthouse before reaching the shore. It was the Halifax Harbor Middle Range Light. After returning to Halifax Harbor, our next stop was the Maritime Museum of the Atlantic, where we got to see many historic artifacts and learn a lot about the history of Nova Scotia. It is Canada's oldest and largest maritime museum. Then it was more sightseeing downtown Halifax, where we saw many landmarks and statues as we made our way back to Halifax Harbor and the boardwalk, where we got a spectacular view of George's Island and its lighthouse. Thanks for tuning in. I hope you enjoyed the show. I'm John David Bruja, on location at Halifax Harbor in Nova Scotia, standing across from George's Island. This has been a special edition of John's Traveling Movie Corner, United States Lighthouse Society, Nova Scotia, and Prince Edward Island Tour. I hope you enjoyed the ride.